Welcome to Marketing Matters with Wheel Media. Today's guest is not your typical attorney who speaks in legalese or strains your attention span. David S. Cohen is a dynamic legal strategist who has carved out a unique focus representing dentists, including every specialty from endo to ortho across the entire United States. With a background that spans from Bucknell University to Seattle University School of Law, David has transformed complex legal challenges into strategic opportunities for dental professionals looking to grow, partner, or transition their practices. What sets David apart isn't just his multi-state expertise or his deep understanding of dental practice dynamics, or dare I say, drama. It's his commitment to making legal processes human and approachable. He does more than protect your legal interests. He helps dental professionals build the practices and careers that they've always dreamed of. David, thank you for being our guest today.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it. And that was a great introduction. And you also have an amazing voice for a podcast.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I come from the history of dental consulting and coaching beginning in the mid-'80s, before we really knew what to call ourselves, frankly, because coaching was still pretty limited to sports. But I really enjoyed. I just fell in love with dentistry. But what I did notice as well along the way is that I had clients enter into associateships that ultimately became their worst nightmare. And I began to realize that they're actually with that associate or partner more waking hours than they are their significant other. And they don't date. They don't think of dating in that relationship. They just think a dentist is a dentist is a dentist, and they just bring them on, and then they've got all these problems, and they didn't foresee the complications behind the questions that inevitably come, and so I think a discussion about associateships and partnerships is long overdue. Whether you're a dentist or whether you are with a DSO or DSO executive, whether you're an attorney that would like to learn from David as a peer, because he's carved such a beautiful niche in this important market. This is what we hope to accomplish. So, David, starting with maybe associateships, because I'm assuming that partnerships kind of come from associateships, don't they? Maybe there are instances where you bring in a partner, but maybe does it generally grow from an associateship?
Yeah, it usually does. We're actually seeing more and more partnerships now just sort of evolve spontaneously, which we don't typically recommend. We're just seeing more and more people go into partnerships with someone that they've not worked with before and haven't had any type of personality testing with. So, we definitely don't recommend that. Partnerships are difficult and they're also easy. And the ones that are difficult are where the personalities don't align. And the best way to understand if the personalities align is having a working relationship, usually through an associate relationship or through personality testing. So the traditional model, though, would be that an associate would come into a practice, would work for anywhere between 6 months to 2 years, and then they would buy into the practice and become a partner after that. And then usually over time, they would then buy out the doctors that are currently in the practice when they come in as partner. And then they usually bring in their own associate who would then buy up and become a partner. And they would just kind of keep cycling like that. That's the traditional model. That still works today. That's still evident today. We do see more and more relationships that are more spontaneous, I would say. We're also seeing DSO dynamics where it may not be a full-blown DSO sale where the doctor will work with the DSO, but they'll bring in a DSO to handle the non-clinical side of the practice. And it's sort of almost like a quasi partner, not an associateship, but a quasi partnerships in that sense. So, but yes, just to answer your question directly, still probably the most common is where an an associate will work in a practice and become a partner.
That makes sense. What do you think the most critical components are of a well-structured associateship contract?
The most common element, or I would say the most important elements of an associate contract are going to differ whether you're on the side of the employer or on the employee. I would assume that most of your clients are probably going to be employers, I would assume.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
as a result of that, I'll touch on that. And when you're an employer, I think, number one, it's really critical that you just have a contract to begin with. I think associate contracts, I am learning, are a very underutilized thing. Many of these doctors that we see do not have contracts in place at all with their associates, and many have contracts in place, but they've pulled it off the internet. They've tried to do it themselves. They just don't value the associate agreement very much, and they don't want to put a lot of effort or money into it. And that's a massive mistake. And the reason why it's a massive mistake is because there are elements that, as an employer, that protect you that you want in a contract. And so that touches on your question, which is, what are the most important elements of a contract? And so, number one, I would start with the term of the agreement. It's not so much the term of the agreement that matters as much as it is the termination provisions. And the term and termination provisions go hand in hand. So if you want to have essentially no termination provision in your agreement as an employer, then the term does become quite important, whether it's a year, 2 years, or more. Usually, I don't recommend longer than a year, and it can be renewed on a yearly basis from there if you're not going to have a termination provision for voluntary termination. And the reason why is because even if you want to lock yourself into an associate as an employer, and in some areas of the country, it's very difficult to find associates. And I could understand and sympathize with someone who wants to lock associate in for a longer period of time. But if it doesn't work out and it's not a good fit, I think the consequences can be catastrophic if you are locked into a long-term agreement, particularly if the associate still wants to be there and they're having a good time and they want to be there, but you don't want them there. So the term and the termination are really important. I'll kind of touch over to termination now. If the termination provisions provide for voluntary and with cause termination, then the term isn't quite as important. And voluntary termination typically entails either party being able to terminate with written notice to the other party. Usually that written notice is about 30 days. It's debatable whether you should do 30, whether you should do 60, whether you should do 90. As an employer, you have to examine how easy it is to find somebody else as a replacement, how important it is to you that that associate is there, and that you can weigh against the consequences of having them there when it's longer than you want them to be there. Because if you are going to terminate the associate, then, usually you have another plan in mind and you might want a smaller portion of time, which is usually like 30 days. However, it usually goes both ways. The associate's usually going to ask for the same thing that you get as an employer. So as an employer, if you have 30-day notice, the associate's also going to want 30-day notice to terminate you. And if you feel like that would put you in a tough spot as an employer, then you need to probably make it a 60-day termination period. And you have to weigh what's more important, being stuck with somebody who you don't want in your practice that you need to terminate, but now you're stuck for 60 days, 2 months, or is it more important to have the flexibility to not have to be stuck with that person and know that if it conversely they terminate you, then you're going to have a very short period of time to find a replacement. So term and termination are really important. Another element that's really important is setting forth the schedule in the agreement. As an employer, you're going to want some flexibility and most likely want it to be a schedule that, it might be anticipated, quote unquote, that the associate's going to work for X period of time. But ultimately, you have the discretion because you may want to change the schedule as an employer based on patient flow. If you're guaranteeing an associate 5 days a week and the patient flow isn't there, then you're going to be stuck. And especially if you're paying the associate with any type of daily minimum, you're really stuck and in a bad spot. If they're paid based on collections or productions exclusively, then, not quite as big of a deal, because then they'll just not be as productive. But the problem is they'll probably leave if there's not enough of that production. So it's good to have flexibility on the schedule. The pay is also critically important. You definitely, as a dentist, want to talk to your financial professional and CPA. Pay is not just about what's market. It's also about what works for you and your practice. That's really critical as well. So you have to examine what works for you, what's going to make you money. You're bringing in an associate so that you can make money from the production of that associate. It's got to make sense, and it's got to underwrite for you. So really important to not just look at what's market, but also to check with your financial team. In addition, it depends on what type of specialty you're in, whether you're a GP or whether you're an orthodontist, whether you're an oral surgeon, pediatric dentist. The pay is going to differ sometimes going to differ based on the specialty that you're in. So always important to check in with your team, your lawyer, your financial team on what the appropriate pay should be. It's also really important that if you're going to pay based on collections or production, that if you're going to make any type of adjustments, whether it's for insurance write-offs, whether it's refunds, redos, courtesy work, discounts, those are all outlined in the agreement. In addition, it's important to outline in the agreement if any type of hygiene or x-rays are going to be included in the calculation for production or collections if you're in a realm of dentistry that does that. And also lab fees. Some specialties don't really have lab fees, but many do. And for those that do, it's important to outline who pays for the lab fees. One fair dynamic would be if you're paying on collections or production, and let's say you're paying 30% of collections, that the associate also carry 30% of the lab fee. That's often done, and we see that quite often. But it's really important to outline all of this, because if you don't, and you don't have an agreement, or the agreement's not very good, then there's going to be a lot of confusion about who gets what. As an employer, if you get sued, employees win litigation about 85% of the time. So, you want things to be as clear as possible. One of the most important reasons to have an agreement as an employer is a non-compete. Non-compete is going to be very specific to the state that the client is in. In some states, non-competes are very enforceable in associate situations, and some are not. And so it's important to check with your attorney on that. We handle deals nationwide, and we often advise our clients based on the specific state whether that non-compete is going to be enforceable, and if it is enforceable, what parameters the non-compete must have in order to be enforceable. Right? Not states don't just say, well, non-competes are enforceable, whatever you want. If non-competes are enforceable, there are going to be standards that have to be met. And usually the standards are comprised of exceptions to the rule, because states don't like restraint on trade. They don't like to stop people from making a living. And they especially don't like to stop young people who are, early in their career from making a living. It's different when you're a dentist and you sell a practice, you sell a bunch of goodwill, you make a bunch of money. It's, as far as holding somebody in that position to a non-compete, that is easier to do than in an associate position where the associate's not having just sold a business and getting a bunch of money and they need to work to make a living, as opposed to someone who just got a bunch of money and doesn't need to work to make a living. So, long story short, it's important that a non-compete is properly outlined if the state does allow it. And in most states, non-competes in sales are applicable, but in associate situations, they are not. So that's important. In addition, confidentiality provisions and non-solicitation provisions are really critical. If you don't have an agreement, or if your agreement's not good enough, then that's not good, because you want to make sure the associate does not solicit or hire your employees. They don't solicit or treat your patients, and they don't solicit your referral sources. All of that you may not have or you probably don't have if you don't have an agreement in place. And many times in states where the non-compete is not enforceable, the non-solicit are often enforceable. So really important on that front. And there are other things that are important in these agreements, but I think just to hit it on the head, I think to summarize, if you're a dentist and you have a practice, have an agreement with your associate. It's really critical to have an agreement, number one. Number two, in that agreement, make sure that you're clearly outlining the term of the agreement and how termination occurs, whether it's voluntary, whether it's for cause. And I didn't touch on that. For cause essentially means a bad act. It means the associate loses their license, they commit a felony, they abuse the staff members and things like that. So you're usually going to want that for sure in an associateship, but you may or may not have the voluntary termination. I usually do recommend that. So the term of termination are critical. The pay is critical, to be very clear on that. The non-compete is very critical, and the schedule. Those are all things that are really important in these agreements.
David, that's helpful. I've noticed that a very clearly defined back door, if you will, that's very well spelled out, whether it is a combination of or the terms and the limitations, it actually contributes to a positive and healthy relationship, doesn't it?
It does, because it's all about accountability. And without accountability, a relationship is very difficult. And when you have an agreement, all parties are held accountable. And it's not about a he said, she said, it's fact. What does our contract say? And what's it governing here? And that's what we agreed to. And that's what we are accountable for and we're accountable to each other for that. Now, I will say, if you are running back to your agreement to see what it says, it's usually not a great sign of a good relationship. But it's there for a reason, and it does hold everybody accountable.
It really does. You don't think you're ever going to need it until you do, right?
Exactly.
And then, are you glad that there's specificity there when you're up against a wall? So let's talk about that. Given your experience, what are the red flags that a practice owner and an associate should look for in those early initial discussions, or the dating period, I call it, when they're looking to, enter into an agreement?
Well, on the employer side, red flags are definitely those where you're doing an interview process and the associate is really more interested in the small picture in terms of, how much vacation they get, things like that, which, don't send the best message. It's particularly in practices where the goal ultimately is to be an owner. As an owner doctor, they're looking for associates that want to come in and want to work hard and are focused on, if they come in and work hard and they do what they're supposed to do and they are an appropriate fit for the culture of the practice, they're going to reap the benefits from that. And if they don't, they'll leave.
Yeah, they're looking for an owner mentality, aren't they?
Correct. As opposed to somebody who is, more wanting to scratch for every inch, for every penny. It doesn't mean, as an associate, you don't negotiate the pay in your agreement. But, nickel and diming or asking for a ton of vacation when you haven't even worked a day in the practice yet, those aren't good signs. And we advise our clients when we're representing the associate not to be like that. But as a doctor in the practice, I think those are definitely big red flags. The other thing too is, if you feel confident that you have a reasonable agreement, because it goes both ways. You can't kick a very unreasonable agreement to an associate and expect that they're not going to jump all over it, right? If you want it to work, it's got to be reasonable. But if you give a reasonable agreement to an associate and you're having to go back and forth more than one or two times with the other attorney, that's a really bad sign. A reasonable agreement should be generally pretty agreeable, subject to some changes, and you should be done. And you should, the contract process is an interview process. It's part of the interview process. How that's handled, how that's negotiated is really critical. So as an employer, I would definitely look out for associates that want to come in and work and they want to produce and they know that the benefits will follow from that, and an associate that is reasonable with any type of changes that they might request to the agreement. On the associate side, Obviously, you want to look for a practice that meets your goals. So if you want ownership, it doesn't do you any good to go to a practice that is not going to offer you ownership. You have to get out in front of it. And again, it's the interview process here it's not just about them interviewing you as an associate. You have to interview them to make sure it's a good fit for you and it's going to meet your kind of longer term goals. So I think that's really important. Also, as an associate, I think, a big red flag is if you have a massive non-compete that isn't reasonable. Just because you have a hunch it's not enforceable or your attorney says it's not enforceable doesn't mean you don't fight to get that out of the agreement, because if the employer has it in there, they probably believe in it. And if you violate it, they're probably going to come after you. And even if you end up on the right side of that, there's time, money, and headaches associated with getting sued. And especially for young doctors who are associates, you don't want to deal, you don't have the money typically, and you certainly don't have the time, and you don't want the headache. So get that out of there if it's unreasonable, if your attorney doesn't feel that it's reasonable, because the non-compete is critical. As an associate, it may not work out where you're working, and that might not be your fault. It could be that the practice doesn't want you there. And if they don't, you're going to have to work. And if you don't have a reasonable territory where you can work because of a non-compete that's just like overly burdensome, then that's going to be a problem, because what you do for a living is dentistry. And that's really your main vehicle to make money. So red flags are where the non-compete is completely unreasonable. Another big red flag is where you just don't see things that are equal. We talked about before earlier in this podcast how it's really important that if you're an employer and you're asking for 30-day written notice for termination, you have to understand most likely you're going to have to give it the other way. Well, as an associate, if you see an agreement where it's not both ways, where it's 120-day notice for you to terminate, but 30-day notice for them, that just tells you the mentality of the employer, and that you're going into a scenario of someone who wants their cake and eat it too, that they actually are comfortable and okay with an unfair dynamic where they have the edge. And relationships are not about winning or losing. It's not a game. This is about making it work for everybody, making sure that everybody has what they want out of the situation. And, if the reason for notice is typically because as an employer, you need to find a replacement, and you need time to do that, to transition. And as an employee, you want time to find another job. So while all of a sudden in that scenario I just mentioned, where it's 120-day notice for the associate, where the practice is essentially telling you it's going to take 4 months to find a replacement, versus 30 days where they don't feel it's as important for you, that you should have ample time to find another job, right? So I think that is a major red flag, where you're seeing things that really should be reciprocal, and they're not.
That's excellent, David. As an attorney, you can obviously see the need for all of the fine print, and the terms that are going to be usually beyond what someone might think of if they don't do that every day. But what you're also saying is that there's something to the relationship building here. And if you're not able to build the relationship at the same time that you're working through a contract negotiation or agreement, that says something, that you have to give some consideration to that, because it's more than just signing a document, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's more than document. It's all about a relationship. And if the relationship is good, like we talked about earlier, you're not going to go back and look at the agreement ever. But it's important to have it, because the contract is the foundation. It's the baseline. It's where the accountability is. And if everybody's acting in accordance with the agreement, that's usually a good relationship where no one has to run back to the agreement, right? If you're questioning whether somebody is compliant, then that's not a good place to be.
How has the landscape of dental associateships changed in the last decade? What have you noticed?
The landscape of associateships has changed in the last decade, I would say, mostly in the capacity of associates wanting ownership a lot more, I think, now than ever. I think a lot of associates, frankly, want ownership before they've earned it. They want ownership. They want to talk ownership before they've stepped a day into the practice. And so there's a much bigger business mentality, I think, with dentists now that are associates than ever. And I think, maybe a decade ago was more on the clinical important side. And now I think it's shifted to be more on the business side. Many doctors want ownership now. And so creating a dynamic where that is possible is really interesting, because as an employer, you could run into the issue where you want an associate in your practice who's going to be a partner, and it's part of your transition strategy, and you work hard and you spend a lot of money on them and get them trained, and they come to the office, and then a year later they leave you, and now you're frustrated. You have to go back to the well. You got to find somebody else. How do you lock someone in like that? But at the same time, you don't want to guarantee that associate ownership, because what if you work with them for a year and they're not ownership material? They're not good with the patients. They don't have a good relationship with the staff, or they're great at both those things, but they don't produce enough. Or maybe they produced enough, but they're not, the work it has issues, right? So, ultimately, I think it always comes back to trust, in my opinion. And conversely, before I get to that, I would say on the associate side, it's the same thing. If you want ownership and you want to be guaranteed that before you even start, you have to understand, number one, you're probably not going to get that. But number two, even if you do get that, why would you want that? You don't know that the practice is going to be a good fit for you when you haven't stepped, a foot in the practice. So ultimately, you can put whatever you want in these agreements. We see them all the time, all these different ownership clauses and this and that. I mean, ultimately, it comes down to trust. And let's work together. If it's a good fit, let's be owners together. And if it's not a good fit, then we're not going to be owners together. The one thing, though, that is important is to know that you're on the same page and that both of you are open to ownership, co-ownership, as opposed to not having the conversation and then learning that that was never in the cards for one of the parties, right? So I think the big shift has been about ownership, and it's how do you handle that? And I think it's best handled by mature conversations and trust that if everyone's on the same page and they want the ownership, that they'll work together to do that. I'm not a big fan of having a valuation done before the associateship even starts. I think that's it's a tricky conversation. I personally don't do valuations. That's not my expertise, but I know that there are a lot of associates who feel like if they are producing in the office, they're contributing to the bottom line of the practice. And then if the valuation were to go up or to take into account their production, they're almost like paying for their own production, and that the valuation should be lower because they've been a reason why the value has gone up. But the flip side to that is business is about bringing patients into the door and not about servicing the patients. As an associate, you're paid to service the patients. That's why you get your 30% of collections or your daily rate or whatever you're getting. You are already paid to do that work. Did you bring new patients in the door? Did you bring new referral sources in the door? That's where the conversations get more sophisticated and appropriate to start analyzing whether the associate's work has contributed to the valuation. But I think it's a difficult conversation to have very far in advance unless you just have a very generous employer who's willing to set the terms in advance so that everybody is clear that if the partnership is going to be viable for the parties, if they like each other, if it's a good fit, then that will be the value. And as long as the employer is willing to live with that, I think it's okay. They might be selling themselves short, but that's certainly a business decision for them to make. But going back to the initial question, that's the big difference that we're seeing now, from a decade ago.
David, with that trend of associates wanting ownership sooner than later, do you think that gives the DSOs an advantage because they're perhaps more structured? They have maybe a few more layers of tolerance to build, the quality of an associate versus a sole proprietor that is like, it's all or nothing. And I barely know how to manage a practice, let alone manage another doctor. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think for an associate, the DSO route is for a certain type. If you're an associate and you're all about business and you want to have ownership in something grander than maybe just the practice you're working in, and you're offered a position from a DSO to go work there, and then oftentimes we do review and see these agreements where the DSO will send them a subscription agreement to be a partner in the DSO, and the associate has to pay typically for the stock. There's a big upside to that because you're part of a bigger thing than just your practice location usually, and you have stock, and it could be a bigger payoff in the long run, but you're also not going to have autonomy or control at all. And you might end up having autonomy and control in the location you're in. If you maybe take over for the senior doctor that's there, that probably sold to that DSO to begin with and is now working for them. Because a lot of these DSOs are hands off. If the practice is going well, they're going to let you run it how you run it. But you'd have to obviously, as an associate, step up in that position. If you're somebody who wants autonomy, you want the business control, you want to run your own business, then the DSO route would not be appropriate, and you would want to associate in a private, boutique type of practice.
I wonder if we could address how successful practices manage the transition from associateship to partnership. You've talked about the timing of what that might be, and the trend may be sooner than later versus years past. But what are the successful components of making that transition that you've seen?
Well, it's really, really critical and important for a DSO that the doctor stays. So, like when they buy a practice, they won't buy it unless the seller that's selling to them is willing to stay in the practice for typically at least 5 years. The DSO doesn't practice. They're not dentists. They need the doctor to practice in the practice. And that's actually why, it's a way for doctors to kind of take some chips off the table, make money, and then get to stay in their own practice. Whereas with a private buyer, they probably would not be working in the practice anymore. And if so, for a much shorter period of time. So it's really important to the DSO that the doctors stay in the practice. So when you now start talking about the associate transition into the ownership, there's a big element to this of the DSO wanting to make sure that the associate stays, because they're a big component of the production and the stability of the practice. In addition, a lot of times the people that sold to that DSO to begin with will honor their 5 years, and sometimes 3 or 4, and then they're out of there. And so they need somebody who's going to be in there that is already an owner, and it's hard for them to leave, and they kind of lock them in. So, if you're an associate and you want to transition into ownership with the DSO, you have to understand it's going to be very difficult to get out. But the upside is you have stock in this company, you have a higher responsibility because you're now an owner based on having stock. And that's the trade-off. As an employer, that's part of your transition strategy in a lot of ways, is to hand off the keys to the associate. So it's really important for the DSO to have both that are locked in. And so that transition process is usually pretty smooth for the associate if they want to be an owner, because everybody wants to know through that initial process that it's a good fit. And then if it is, it also allows the doctor time to build up some money that they can use to buy in. And then, the transition usually will occur from there. Now, also, too, there are occasions where a doctor sells. We do over 300 practice sales a year in our firm nationwide. And when we do these DSO deals, sometimes the DSO will want to make the associate a partner almost as part of the deal. Like they'll want stock provided to the associates so that they'll stay, because the valuation of the practice is based on the numbers the practice is doing. But if let's say one of the associate doctors isn't going to stay, because they're pissed off that the owner's selling to a DSO or something, that's going to lower the value of the doctor selling. So it's not good for them. And it's going to make it less appealing to the DSO. So it's not good for them. And so they often will want to lock that associate in. And sometimes the associate will get to be almost grandfathered into stock without having to pay for it as a result of that.
I wonder if that's what's driving the overall trend in the industry for doctors wanting partnership or ownership sooner than what we saw 10, 15 years ago.
I think it probably is a driver. I think doctors are selling to DSOs at insane values if you take into account what a doctor's used to getting for their dental practice. We commonly have clients tell us, can't believe that this kind of money is being thrown out at us dentists. This is never something I imagined I would be able to make as a dentist. And I think maybe the young doctors are seeing that, and they ultimately want to own a practice they can build up and maybe sell. And a lot of these doctors too actually are driven by just wanting to be entrepreneurial and almost build their own practice pods, almost to fight against the DSO industry. They want to own 5 practices. There's just a lot, there's more of an entrepreneurial spirit. I do personally have some fears about the quality of the care on the clinical side because of this trend. A lot of doctors are doing a great job of staying up on their CE and going to great courses and really learning what they need to be great clinicians. But I do think, as a separate topic, there's a concerning shift, I think, away from quality of care on the clinical side.
There really can be. And that is a concern I've heard addressed more than once. And given the size of a DSO or a DPO, having a clinical director that can own that is really essential so that you don't lose sight of that quality. Otherwise, DSOs become the big bad wolf that, so many have accused them of being, and they don't have to be. They've learned a lot of lessons in the school of hard knocks. I love how you're able to address both sides of the table, David. You're clearly skilled and experienced in representing the associate as well as the owner. How valuable is that? What are the financial protections that maybe they should be looking at? We talked about non-competes and terms and so forth, but are there any specific financial clauses or protections that we should address?
Yeah, I think maybe the most interesting financial protection area that isn't contemplated all the time, and it is pretty unique, is where you have like a specialist that comes in and does work in the practice. And especially if it's like an orthodontist, let's say a practice is a GP and they bring in an orthodontist. Well, orthodontic treatment can stretch over 1-2 years, right? And so how do you deal with that if there's going to be a termination of the agreement? And sometimes that ortho work is prepaid, especially if it's like Invisalign or something. Oftentimes that work will be prepaid. And so like if you're paying a doctor on collections, but the money's been prepaid, how do you navigate that? Because, until the doctor has actually completed the treatment, they haven't earned all of the money that's been prepaid. Often why orthodontic doctors get daily rates, but it's important though to make sure financially as an employer that you are governing that. In addition, it's important to understand that you have to provide, you can't, have patient abandonment. You have to make sure that the patient is taken care of, especially if you have a non-compete. It can be very difficult for the doctor to continue to finish the treatment. Also, you don't want to lose the patient to the doctor that's an associate upon termination. So how do you navigate those waters for a longer term treatment for work that your office doesn't do? If it's an orthodontic practice, well, that's an easy transition. They stay with the practice and they work with another orthodontist in the practice. But if they're a specialist coming in from the outside, you got to really be careful and navigate and contemplate the financial side of that. And as a side note, the patient abandonment issue there.
Good point. What would you say are are the top 3 reasons why a partnership fails?
Top 3 reasons why partnerships fail. Number one is unequivocally its personality. Um, Number two, I think partnerships fail. I will say the money. I mean, it's so overwhelmingly personality that that's almost always the reason. But money is a reason. Not having a proper split of the money in the partnership. Like for instance, you split everything based on percentage ownership. Well, if the partners are 50-50, for instance, but one of them is doing 70% of the production in the office, they're not going to be happy and they're not going to be motivated to be optimal with their production, because why would they? They're getting paid only 50% for 70% of the work. And then conversely, why would the doctor that's, 50% getting in, but only doing 30% of the work be motivated when they can work less and get paid more? So, that often can cause issues if you don't have proper dynamics in your splits of the money and the costs in your partnership. And it's important to have good attorneys that can help you structure that, and good financial team that can help you structure that so that you don't run into that issue, because there can be a lot of animosity when it comes to splitting money in these partnerships when it's not set up the proper way. And then the third reason I would say the partnerships don't work out, I would say nowadays, is a different vision. Partners go in terms of an exit. Partners go into these partnerships with certain visions, and then it can change over time. We have a ton of doctors that we've seen that are the senior doctor in the practice. They never would even think about selling to a DSO. It's the last thing they want to do. They bring in a partner who assumes that they're going to come into the practice and they're going to take over one day, or they'll be an equal partner one day. And then the senior doctor wants to sell to a DSO because they just change. They get compelled to want to do that. And the associate doesn't want to, because they're going to be they're going to be in the practice for a lot longer. The senior doctor might be done in 5 years, so it's a perfect time to sell to a DSO. But the younger doctor may have 30 years to practice and they don't want to sell to a DSO. And that can cause a rift and cause some change. And so I think that would probably be the third reason that we're seeing these partnerships not work.
Of those 3, it sounds like the proportion of those 3 is personality. It really is their ability to get along.
Correct. That's the number one reason by far.
If that's the case, then you've probably learned to rely on some personality trait assessments to help one side or the other kind of see what they're really getting into, that you don't get over a simple interview or a dinner.
Yeah, for sure. There are personality tests out there. I can't profess to be an expert in which ones a doctor should consider or use. What I can say, though, is that they're out there, and also that I think equally as good, or if not even better, is just working together in a business capacity before being owners together. And that, the main way to do that is through an associateship.
Mm-hmm. There really isn't an agreement prior to an associateship that allows them a working interview like you would with maybe a staff member or a team member, so that you can get a feel for what the practice is like before you actually sign something. Have you ever seen anything like that?
I have seen it. It doesn't happen very often, but I have seen that. It would take a lot of trust. The doctor that owns the practice would have to understand and believe that there wouldn't be much damage caused, by them, the associate competing or something, if it didn't work out and then they opened up across the street. It's such a short period of time, it probably wouldn't make a difference. But it can be very disruptive is the problem. For a doctor to come in and then leave, it's not a good look in the community, number one. And number two, it's disruptive because of your staff and all that. So I don't personally find that to be a great way. But really, I mean, I guess in any sense, anytime an associate comes in, you're kind of risking that, whatever you want to call it. If you want to call it a trial or not a trial, you're risking that. But recommendations and things that you look for in your typical interview, and I think a lot of great consultants have criteria that they can help doctors through about how to properly do an interview and do that process and ask the right questions and look for the right proof and evidence of answers, I think is also very helpful.
So, David, how would someone contact you? Maybe they're a doctor who doesn't want to make the same mistakes they made before. Maybe they're not even out of school yet, but want to enter into an associateship, but would like to have some representation. How would they contact you?
Yeah, the best way to contact me would be to email me. It's David at Cohen Law Firm, PLLC.com. David at COHENLAWFIRM as in Mary, P as in Paul, LC.com. And our phone number is 972-294-7531. And, we're great with being responsive, and we do over 100 associateships a year. And we also deal with practice, purchase, sales, and partnerships all the time. So if anybody is interested, that's a great way to reach me. And it could be that you're just considering this and you have questions, and I'm always happy to chat and answer things preliminarily, even if you're not jumping into the situation that you're going to be going into.
Wonderful. That's a lot of experience, David. How did you find yourself in this specific niche of dentistry? How did that happen? Was that all pre-thought, or did you just kind of fall into it like I did?
Yeah. I will say it wasn't pre-thought. My father is a periodontist. And so, growing up, I was around a lot of his colleagues. And so I was always kind of immersed from the outside-ish in the dental world. Through other work, I came to meet dentists and dentists who wanted to sell practices and buy practices. It was interesting to me. And it also was an area that was needed. At the time when I started my firm in 2010, there was a lot of demand, but not really many resources. So I took that on at that time and built the firm in 2010, all the way obviously through today. There's a lot more people today that do what I do than there was 15 years ago. But, we've really made a conscious effort to be different in the level of concierge service that we provide, the responsiveness that we provide, and the experience.
Wonderful. David, it's been a pleasure having you. Thank you for your time, for your expertise, and all that you shared with us. It was great having you. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it. I know you guys do a great job at WEO and have done so for a very long time. And I'm privileged to be part of this podcast and look forward to seeing it produced.